Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, your regular weekly fix of 10 minutes of ancient warfare concentrated stuff to distract you and take you away completely from the modern world. And of course, what we do here is I attempt to answer questions that you have sent in via email, by postcard, a comment on a previous video, however you like to get them to me. You can, of course, back us on Patreon, one of three different levels. I've also been asked that there's a new podcast coming up from Caravanserai, which is the Ancient History podcast. So check that one out. Now, today's question is from Jamie Peter 3567. Hi, Jamie. Or Peter, or Jamie Peter. Not sure. Okay, so here's one for Ancient Warfare Answers, which Uncle Murray, thank you, Uncle Murray. No, talking to myself. What was the first war game? Did it really start at WATU, or are there examples of ancient generals playing games to practice for war, an ancient equivalent of a modern war game? Now, of course, WATU is the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, WATU, and I'm not even sure it's said as a word. One of the things, of course, about acronyms is, are they said as words or are they said as letters? One of those tricky things around the world. Some are said as words, some are not. Anyway, for that, now, when you asked this question, Jamie, I immediately thought tabletop wargaming, not wargame as in practical war games with actual armies. And in that sense, you do occasionally see, especially in film, with no historical basis whatsoever, very similar sand tables with terrain for little units to be moved around the table, or little units representing the army to explain what's going to happen tactically. Now, of course, that's very good visually for us, the viewer, but not something we necessarily know of. The other one, of course, which is a typical one, is the drawing with a stick in the sand or in the dirt, which again makes sense, is very visual, useful to us. But again, we don't know that that was done. So those are things you see, but where there's not really any evidence for them. Yeah, Cleopatra has them about the Battle of Actium, for instance, even. So in that sense, we don't get them. The first war game as such, even though there were toy soldiers earlier, the first war game is generally associated with Little Wars by H.G. Wells. Yes, that H.G. Wells, published in 1913. That's the game that Peter Cushing used to play and, of course, other famous war games. So that's the first war game as a sense. Now, what you're talking about, of course, is not that. So what was all that about, Murray? The first war game where you get groups of actual soldiers playing under combat conditions or maneuvering under combat positions, under combat conditions. So the Western Approaches Tactical Unit is created to disseminate new tactics to counter German submarine tactics, and basically using units and things like that to practice. And that continues today when you have these armies doing operations and doing training exercises. Now, there's some very intriguing pieces of ancient evidence which suggest something like that may have been going on. Now, the first one, of course, are the maneuvers by armies, whether it be that a particular army comes out of its camp and lines up for battle, offering battle to the enemy who don't accept. And that, in a way, is a kind of what we're talking about, but it's normally in the sense of one army offering battle and the other army refusing it. The other thing which seems to be similar to what we're talking about is, of course, that on several occasions you have sources telling us about one particular army drawing up, the enemy accepting their offer of battle, and then one or the other army maneuvering for hours until such time as the general wanted to engage. And so that presumes that they are going through formations, they are doing counter marches, and they are doing all sorts of different maneuvers to distract the enemy. Probably not the maneuver that they will, in fact, pull off in the battle if that one is intended. But on several occasions there's a an ambush waiting, so presumably the maneuvering is to take attention away from that position, things like that. That is all tentatively suggested in the sources, not explicitly explained to us. And of course, again, visually, you can't really go past the climactic battle in Spartacus for that. Watching the formations, ballet like moving around the battlefield, and of course, all of that would require drill. Now, drill on a parade ground isn't the same as a war game as we're talking about. Now, to get to the very nitty gritty of, yes, but what about actual practicing combats? With the ancient world, of course, very rarely are you going to find an opponent willing to practice with you. And so what you get instead is little combats, little skirmishes and things like that. You get Cicero talking about that when he's in Asia, and several other generals talking about little combats between their troops and small numbers of enemy troops. But you do occasionally get the idea of what would be, in our modern sense, live fire exercises, and they seem to be the closest that we get to this idea of the war game. So, for instance, in the SHA's biography of Avidius Cassius, a very peculiar source for this, he talks about the fact that once a week there was a drill of all the soldiers in which they even shot arrows and engage in contests in the use of arms. For he said that it was shameful that soldiers should not be trained while athletes, wild beast fighters, and gladiators were, for the soldiers' future labours, if familiar to them, would be less onerous. So in that sense, there seems to be some kind of combat between units within the same army to train them in combat. And one of the things about this biography of Avidius Cassius is that Avidius Cassius is the stereotypical great commander. And so from that perspective, it's like, this is something that other commanders did, so that the literary example that's been called upon would have been familiar to all readers of that biography, which again implies that this was a common thing to do, and it wouldn't have shocked anyone to have such a live fire exercise, for lack of a better term. Now, when we then go back and look at other things in the history of ancient warfare, there are several moments where Epaminondas, for instance, encouraged his Theban hoplites to learn wrestling. The story in the sources is so that they would defeat the Spartan wrestlers and therefore learn not to be afraid of Spartans on the battlefield. But, and this is a bit controversial, the idea, of course, that wrestling maneuvers would be useful in a combat context for hoplites seems to be something that both Epaminondas and Socrates talk about. One of the reasons I think Socrates is spending a lot of time in the wrestling schools is to see that, because, of course, that's happening in the middle of the Peloponnesian War. Anyway, that's controversial. But the thing there, of course, is that if you then take that as a combat training idea, the reason for the Thebans under Epaminondas's guidance practicing wrestling is a combat maneuver. So it is, in a sense, not just a drill, but combat practice. We also have some evidence of the hoplomachia being taught normally by charlatans. That's the problem with the evidence, that, Socrates is talking about these people who teach, how to fight, and normally it's crap. It's not really actually anything practical. But the idea, of course, is that there is some kind of practical teaching going on of fencing, what we would call fencing, or practicing with weapons so that you get better one-on-one. This is in the Laches or Laches dialogue. And the interesting thing with that is that doesn't take a lot to go from drill and practicing of maneuvers to combat training and combat practice. And, there's sort of several ideas, and we get actually the 100th issue of the magazine, which will come out at the end of this year, is about single combats. And the idea of single combats, of course, those participants needed to be skilled at that. They're not skilled in the drill of the massed unit. They are, but not just that. They are also skilled in arms personally, and that requires not only drill but practice and presumably, like every film we've ever seen. And the image in my head at the moment is of the hobbits learning how to fight from Boromir and Aragorn. That idea of training and mock combat. And of course, as you go forward into the medieval period, there's a lot more mock combat going on and testing of shield walls and things like that. But the actual evidence of what you're asking about, war games, is very limited. But I think extrapolating all of that stuff out, you could argue that it did in fact happen. But it's not something our sources tend to emphasize. So I hope that answers your question, Jamie Peter, and look forward to the next episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. Thanks. Bye.